This Lent, we're exploring who killed Jesus.
Many people are convinced that they know the answer.
But we've gathered 16 suspects as we retrace the events of Holy Week in this special 6-week podcast.
With your help, we'll discover who really killed Jesus.
This podcast is a production of progressivechristianity.org
and University Christian Church, San Diego.
I'm Caleb Lines.
And I'm Marshela Salgado.
This is Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast, episode 4, Maundy, Thursday. Welcome back to Who Killed Jesus, where we are exploring the events of Holy Week day by day to try and discern who really killed Jesus and why. So far, we've talked about Palm Sunday, where we see Jesus and his disciples stage this anti-imperial protest against the authority of Rome. Then on Monday, we see Jesus go into the temple and overturn the money changers' tables in an affront to the religious establishment. Then on Teaching Tuesday, we see Jesus out in the courtyard, confronting once again the religious establishment and the purity system. And on Women's Wednesday, we see Jesus being anointed as king by a woman, and Judas making plans to betray Jesus. That brings us to today, Maundy, Thursday, a more familiar day of the week. So, Marshela, who do we have so far as suspects?
We have quite a few suspects. And again, if you want a refresher on all this, you can go back to the first few episodes of the podcast to hear a little bit more about them. But first up on our list, we have the Roman Empire. Along with the Roman Empire, we have Emperor Tiberius and Pontius Pilate. We have one of my favorites, Caiaphas, even though I don't think he's necessarily high up on my suspect list.
Okay.
I do like him. I like learning about him. And so Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest. And then we have the Pharisees and the Sadducees, along with U.S. politics.
Oh, yes. U.S. politics.
U.S. politics, yes. And Judas is, I think, very clearly a suspect.
Yes.
And we'll learn more about that today, too.
Today, right.
Yeah, but last week we talked about him as well.
Now, Courtney Love is also on our murder board.
Yes,
and she
is.
hasn't emerged yet.
She hasn't emerged, but I think she's floating there in the background.
Okay.
We can personally point fingers to her for.
She's pulling the strings?
Yes. I think so. I'm trying to keep her front and center.
That's right. Okay.
Conspiracy theory.
Okay. So do you have any favorite suspects so far? That's quite a few that it seems that we found some motive for.
Yes. It's really hard to pick a favorite right now, but I think the Roman Empire, along with that, the Pharisees and Sadducees. Last week, we learned a lot more about Teaching Tuesday and how they were trying to corner Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think specifically so that they would have reason to arrest him.
Yeah.
So they're very high on my suspect list. And they're not a favorite suspect in the sense that I like them, but they're favorites in pointing fingers.
And pointing fingers?
Yeah.
You know, I think I'm still in the place where I'm seeing multiple angles here with different people working together. But one of my favorites, I think, is the parallels to U.S. politics and the way that we see political leaders acting today versus the way we saw political leaders acting in Jesus's time, and people's own self-interest and thirst for power and greed and all of that, and how that is both like a political thing and a religious thing, as much as we don't want that to be a part of the religious system that it is, and that people want to hang on to power there as well. And even that, gasp, maybe like politicians and religious leaders might cooperate together.
We don't see that happening today at all.
Never. And certainly not past the 1970s with the rise of the religious right. Nothing like that has happened
not at
in
all.
the United States.
That is very scary, though, that there are parallels 2,000 something years later.
Yeah. I mean, yes, very clearly that we can see religious leaders and political leaders cooperating together in real and concrete ways.
Yeah.
So
I
I'm
agree.
curious, who do you think is going to emerge today as a favorite suspect?
Well, Maundy, Thursday, which
Hmm.
is far more familiar than like what happened Monday through Wednesday.
Right? That's the day we agreed that sometimes we step back into the church if we were observing
Yes,
Holy Week. We'd come back
exactly.
in on Monday, Thursday. Yeah.
Yep. And very clearly, I think Judas, because
Hmm.
it's the night that Judas, sat at the table with Jesus, knowing that he had betrayed him, and that he basically points, to Jesus in that moment, and that's how they know who to arrest.
Yeah.
So I think Judas will clearly emerge as a top suspect.
Yeah. How about the disciples? Do you think that they will stand with Jesus, or do you think that we'll get some clear? I mean, we know obviously how they end up reacting. We know the
Right.
story,
Right.
but do you think the disciples will be cleared through the events of Maundy, Thursday?
I don't know. That's a good question. Again, last week I mentioned that if it were me standing next to Jesus,
Hmm.
I would love to think that I'd be like, I will follow you and I will stand with
I'll
you
be at the
and I
cross.
will be
I'll be
yes.
next to you, Jesus.
Exactly. But I might be a little bit more in line with Peter and just be like, me? No, I wasn't hanging out with them because
Yeah.
this means like if I was
Yeah.
hanging out with them, that means that I very likely will be arrested and crucified
Uh,
also. So yeah, I don't know. We'll
yeah.
see about the
You're
disciples.
right. It's easy to say that, isn't it? That just like Peter does, that I will be there with you.
Yep.
Yeah, not me. I will be there
Yeah.
until the time comes. And
Yep.
no, I don't know anything about Jesus. Jesus,
Exactly.
I've never met Jesus. Yeah,
Exactly. And
yeah,
that's actually something you hear a lot in true crime, right?
yeah.
That you don't know how you'll react until you're there.
Ah,
Like
yeah.
whether you're, the family member of a victim
Uh
who
huh.
says like, "Oh, I'll easily forgive. I'll easily, like if it were me, I would forgive." You don't
Yeah,
know until you're there. Or if you're somebody who's the victim of a crime
yeah.
or somebody who happened to be present in the moment,
Mm,
how would you react? You really don't know until you're there. But I
yes.
can tell you, I love to think I'm radical
Yeah.
but deep down inside, I would probably be freaking out in that moment because it would mean death on a cross
Yeah.
too, alongside Jesus.
It's easy to say when you're listening to a story or observing,
Yeah.
later to say, "Don't walk down that dark alley. That's a bad decision."
Don't you know what you're doing?
Don't you know? Yeah,
Yeah.
call the police. Peter, be there with
Exactly.
Jesus.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's a lot harder in the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah. And I like how Mark does point that out.
Mm,
And I mean, that's one of our human um what's the word? It's one of our weaknesses
mm,
as humans. So
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a good setup, I think, for what we're going to see in Maundy, Thursday. Let's take a quick break, and let's come back, and we'll get into the events of Maundy, Thursday.
Who Killed Jesus, a true crime podcast, is a special 6-week exploration of who really killed Jesus and why.
This podcast is brought to you by ProgressiveChristianity.org, celebrating 30 years of reclaiming Jesus' original message of justice, peace, and liberation while proclaiming an intellectually honest Christianity.
And University Christian Church, San Diego, an authentic, inclusive, and progressive congregation in the heart of San Diego's Hillcrest neighborhood that declares God's love for all people.
Welcome back to Who Killed Jesus, where we are walking through the events of Holy Week, and we have made it all the way to Maundy, Thursday. So maybe, Marshela, an important place to start is why on earth we call it Maundy.
Yes, I had no idea. And I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure I never learned it in Sunday school. I never learned it in youth group.
Yeah.
I don't know if somebody preached it at some point, but
Yeah.
I was surprised to finally learn what Maundy means. Please remind us, because now I can't remember it.
Okay, so growing up, I thought people were saying Monday, Thursday.
Oh, that's cute.
Like it's Monday, Thursday. And I thought, well, why did something happen on Monday and Thursday?
Right.
Why is it Monday, Thursday? Or was there something really weird about Holy
Uh-huh.
Week, and like that was a week where space-time kind of
Right.
converged and Monday and Thursday happened on the same day. What is Monday, Thursday?
Right.
Well, no, that was not right.
It's Maundy.
And I guess that's not a word we use
No.
real often, and that's because it's from the Latin word for mandate.
Oh, that's right.
Maundy
Yeah.
for mandate, and it's because in the Gospel of John, Jesus gives a new mandate, a new commandment that
Mhm.
his disciples should love one another as he has loved them. So
Mhm.
in John, Jesus gives the new commandment. And so it's honoring that portion of the Maundy Thursday story. And so
Uh-huh.
I think one thing that we did realize through reading this that's probably pretty important is that actually the events of how that whole Last Supper thing went
Mhm.
down varies depending on what you read.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really important because John, and they mentioned this
Yeah.
in the first part of the chapter of the last week. Um, John's story is very different. Not very different, but it's not as well. He goes on and
he
on
goes on. Yeah.
for chapters, I believe.
Yeah.
But it is significantly different than Mark's
Yeah.
also. And Mark also gives us like the words of institution
Yeah.
that were given that night and that we usually use in communion and stuff. I was really fascinated by seeing the differences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think maybe this is a great point to talk about the differences in historicity between our
Hmm.
different sources.
Hmm.
And so the earliest version of what today we call the words of institution, this is my body, this is my blood, that a
Hmm.
lot of churches say anytime they observe communion or the Eucharist or however it is that that particular tradition
Hmm.
observes this, that the earliest version of those are found in Paul in First Corinthians, that we find Paul's version of that. And so then Mark's come along later, several decades later, we get Mark's
Hmm.
version of those. And in John, we don't get the words of institution, and instead we get what scholars often call the farewell discourse. And this is
Hmm.
like 2 or 3 chapters of Jesus giving a long speech
Right.
about how it's the end. And I think this is one of the ways that we know that the Gospel of John isn't really very historical because in
Hmm.
the synoptic gospels Jesus mostly speaks in parables,
Hmm.
short sayings, things that people can remember that you can pretty clearly tell existed as oral tradition for
Right.
several decades that people just told, right?
Hmm.
The parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance, you can see how people could tell that story. Whereas when we get Jesus talking in long, flowing, eloquent speeches, that's not probably something
Right.
that people remembered
Right.
real well. I think we can pretty safely assume that that's the creation of the gospel writer, in this case,
Mhm.
in John.
Okay.
And so I think that the farewell discourse, pretty as it is,
Mhm.
probably doesn't actually trace back to
Right.
Jesus.
Right.
And s
Okay.
and so but we do get the words of institution in Mark,
Mhm.
and I think that's probably, right. And
Mhm.
the other thing that Mark tells us is that we actually have this Last Supper representing 2 different things.
Mhm.
And in Mark, it's a Passover meal,
Right.
and in John, it's actually not a Passover
Mhm.
meal. It happens
Right.
before Passover.
I did not know that actually. I really appreciated learning that also because that also changes the meaning
Mhm.
of the evening and what was actually happening at that table and
Yeah.
at that dinner also. So I was pretty fascinated by that statement that they're very different.
Yeah, very different because in the Mark and the Synoptic Gospels, so Mark,
Mhm.
Matthew, Luke, we find Jesus's Last Supper as a Passover meal,
Mhm.
as like instituting a new Passover that we can talk about in just a minute. And in John's Gospel, it's the day before
Mhm.
the Passover preparations and meal.
Right.
And that, I think, is theological. And so scholars kind of debate this, but I
Mhm.
think the majority of scholars agree that probably the synoptics version of events
Mhm.
is more likely to be historical,
Right.
and John's is more likely to be theological. Because in the synoptics, we find Jesus having this last Passover meal, which that makes sense, right? They're gathered for a meal. It's the Passover meal. They're
Mhm.
doing something religious. And then it is the next day that Jesus is crucified at 9 in the morning.
Mhm.
Whereas in the Gospel of John, it is not a Passover meal. It's just a supper they're having together.
Right.
And then the next day, as the lambs are about to be sacrificed at noon, that
Right.
is the time at which Jesus is crucified on the cross, showing that he is the sacrificial lamb, right?
Mhm.
So John puts theological overtones
Right.
on this, and I think that's pretty important for us to
Right.
recognize that starting with Maundy Thursday, something theological is happening based on
Mhm.
the way the story is told.
Right. Right. I like that you're saying that. I mean, basically, John had his own like theology to
Mhm.
impose on there, right?
Yes.
But with Mark, also the Passover meal, the Passover, and we talked about this in, I think, the first week. The Passover was very significant to the Jewish
Yeah.
community because it's one of their biggest, if not their biggest feast. It's symbolic of the time that the Jews, or sorry, the Israelites, right, were set free. And but for them, that moment, that dinner was also their final meal before they embarked on the big journey to go
Mhm.
find the promised land and,
Yeah.
like their freedom. So, I mean, that has significance in Jesus actually like having a meal that night too. I mean, aside from the fact
Mm.
that Jesus also like the significance of meals in Jesus's ministry also.
Yeah.
But I think that takes on a whole new meaning than just what we usually see with like John, where it's like, the sacrificial lamb and
Yeah.
Jesus taking the place. So I really appreciated that. I really loved learning that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great point that, okay, they're having this meal before going on this adventure, and right, the thing that would turn into 40 years in the wilderness.
Right.
That this is the meal that serves as that invitation to his disciples, that they are invited to then go on this next stage of the journey as the ancient Israelites did.
Hmm.
And what did they choose to do?
Mm, they abandon him.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah. This is
so
the don't go down the dark alley
don't
kind
go
of
down
moment.
that dark.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, they abandon him. I mean, and even Jesus points that out to Peter
Yeah.
and basically all of them. So it's what they call the failed discipleship, like the
Mm.
failed disciples. And that's we don't talk about that enough either. I mean, we talk about Peter
Yeah.
denying him, before the yeah. So Peter denying him. We talk about Judas.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about all the disciples, they all abandoned him. Not
Yeah.
one of them stayed with him.
Yeah.
That's sad.
It is sad, and but also understandable.
No, totally understandable.
And I
I
think
told you I would probably be the first to be like, "I'm so sorry. I love you, but I am scared." I mean, obviously there would be fear
Yeah.
there, like he was saying some pretty radical things.
Yeah.
They all knew at this point that he was going to be cornered. He
Yeah.
was in trouble. Um, yeah, so fear is natural.
Fear is natural. I think one of the things that I appreciate about the Gospel of Mark is that we do find ultimately, though, that people are drawn back into right relationship, and that's
Mhm.
that's the goal, is that people then, should they come back, find a God who always forgives and always,
Right.
wants to welcome people back into the fold. And so I
Mhm.
think that the other thing we discover is that, like, ultimately, looking beyond these stories, that they do end up following Jesus in a different way, right? Like,
Right.
all of these disciples are, at least, theologically, historically, martyred, and
Mhm.
so that they
Right.
do end up dying for their faith
Mhm.
because they end up following Jesus during times of persecution,
Right.
and that becomes the Christian story for the first 3 centuries
Right.
on and off
Yeah,
of Christian history.
definitely.
So
Yeah.
I think that the meal is significant, and the fact that we get Jesus using this story to invite them on the journey,
Mhm.
and then them
Yeah.
deciding, at least initially, not to join him on that, is important,
Right.
and the language he
Hmm.
uses about body and blood.
Right.
And how did that strike you, the separation of body and blood?
So that's something that theologically I really dealt with and
Mm,
struggled with when I was, trying to figure out exactly
mhm,
what I believe. Because what does it mean? Like, this is my body, this is my blood, it depends on what faith you grew up in or
yeah,
what tradition you grew up in. Some people literally think that it's like, Jesus's body and blood. And
mhm,
um so I really appreciated how they explain that a little bit more, like when they talk about like broken and um yeah. I would like for you to explain it a little bit more. You explained so well, Caleb. I really
Well, I think it's significant that, like, that one of the things that we sometimes forget about is that this is, um this is something very significant, right? That
Mhm.
they're and that they are Jesus is put to death by empire, and that it is something that is, an act that is committed because of Jesus's belief, and so the violent death that, Jesus is referencing here, I think is significant, body and blood, not body and spirit, but my
Mm.
body is being separated from my blood because
Mhm.
I've been killed by empire.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the things that we're finding here is
Mhm.
that we're not finding like a divine foreknowledge of what's going to happen, which a lot of
Right.
people think.
Right.
Like Jesus is prophesying his own death. He knew it was coming.
He
Well,
knew it was coming because of what I mean, it was intentional. It
yeah.
was intentional, like, and I think we see that starting on
Yeah.
Palm Sunday when he
Yeah.
walks in and he
Mm,
opposes the
mhm.
parade on the other side, when he's challenging, in the temple
Yeah.
when on Teaching Tuesday,
Mm,
and he doesn't step into their traps, but
yeah.
he knows they're trying to set I mean, it's all intentional, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, by that point, it had to be pretty clear. I mean, you spend a whole
Mhm.
week confronting people in authority who have a habit of killing people who disagree
Right?
with them. I
Exactly.
mean, it's probably pretty close,
Yeah.
or pretty evident what's going to happen. You can probably feel the noose kind of tightening there,
Mhm.
and so I think that that's what we find on Maundy Thursday is Jesus inviting the disciples to participate, him giving them ways to remember him when he's gone as I think realizes that
Yeah.
here's what's coming.
Yeah.
And so in Mark, we also find Judas there the whole time. And
Mhm.
so in the last week, Morgan Crossan point out that in the Gospel of John, we find Judas in this dramatic scene, leaving in the midst of the farewell discourse. But
Right.
in Mark, Judas is there the whole time and then theoretically goes
Mhm.
to tell the temple authorities after the
Mhm.
meal because the meal has been planned in secret so that it
Right.
could happen.
I loved
Yeah.
learning that,
Mm,
like he asked two of his disciples the same way that he did on Palm Sunday to carefully go find this
mm,
person
mhm.
and so that he can prepare the room and that they can get that all set up. But he doesn't want Judas to know. He
Yeah.
does it very quietly,
Yeah.
intentionally, because this meal is so important and this
Mm,
time with his disciples is
mm.
so important. He doesn't want that to be the place where they find and arrest him. So
Yeah.
it's all very secretive. I
Yes.
I loved learning that.
Yeah, and, before we leave the meal, another thing I think that's really important is that it was like a real meal that they were
Mhm.
having, and that for the first part of Christian history,
Mhm.
the Eucharist, the communion meal, didn't really exist as such, but it was really
Mm.
just a meal that
Actual
people were
meal.
having. The whole
Yeah.
talking about Jesus thing happened around meals. And that's, I think,
Mhm.
in part because meals were so essential to who Jesus was that
Right.
we find him, especially in the Gospel of Mark, gathering people around meals, often in scandalous ways, inviting people that he wasn't supposed to be around, who were ritually impure, who people looked down upon, to
Right.
sit at the table as equals, I think was
Mhm.
significant. Borg and Crossan also point out that this event, the Passover meal, the Last Supper, mirrors Jesus's feeding of the multitude in the
Mhm.
Gospel of Mark, using same four verbs in the Gospel of
Mhm.
Mark that is used at the feeding of the multitude as a
Yeah.
reminder that meal practice is essential to what it means to be a
Mhm.
Jesus follower.
Yes,
Mm,
and that's a very radical call.
yeah.
Inclusivity.
Mhm.
People that
Yeah.
normally, and we talked about, like, the
Yeah.
purity laws and
Yeah.
all these, like, restrictions that people had upon them, and Jesus didn't, necessarily adhere to all of that,
Yeah.
and inviting people that, were probably ritually impure and to be a part of these meals, and they were
Mm,
actual meals, and leading also, like, the Lord's Prayer
yeah.
when we talk about, like, they were praying for, "Thy kingdom come,
Yeah.
thy will be done, and then give us this day our daily
Mm,
bread,"
mhm.
because what like, daily bread, feed us, like,
Yeah.
this is we're
Yeah.
poor, we have a hard time getting our food, and these meals is the sharing of food, and you see
Yeah.
that in the feeding of the multitude, like the
Mm,
loaves and the fish, right? Most likely, there weren't just 2 loaves and 2 a
yeah.
couple of fish. Um, it was a sharing of resources.
Yeah.
Anybody who brought food, let's
Yeah.
share.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty radical call on us if we're gonna
Yeah.
follow Jesus, because then that means we have to share our resources too.
Yeah.
That sounds very socialist.
Oh, Jesus a socialist. Yeah, I mean, it's almost like they had all things in common. I think I've read that in the Bible as well. I think that it's so significant to the way we think about this when we practice communion or whatever it is we call
Mhm.
in our various traditions, that it's not really something magical or salvific that's happening there, at least not in the taking of the elements, but the
Mhm.
salvific piece comes in the practice
Yeah.
of sharing and
Mhm.
of changing the world to be more like what Jesus wanted it to be. So I mean, those meals were all about barrier breaking, boundary
Right.
breaking. And so I think that's what we get in the invitation in
Mhm.
this Passover meal is to continue those kinds of meals. And so we find Judas then leaving, betraying Jesus,
Mhm.
and and then Jesus goes to the garden of Gethsemane and he prays,
Mhm.
and again, we find a prayer like, "Take this yoke away from me. Let your
Right.
will be done, not mine," whatever translation of that we're reading. And so
Mhm.
some people want that to be, okay, he's prophesying his own thing. But Borg and Crossan point out that this is like a fatalistic resignation to
Right.
like,
Yes. Or like God, like when
yeah,
he says, "Your will be done," like,
yeah,
it's like, "God, like, you're condemning me," and
yeah.
that's not really what it is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, it's just a realization that the noose is tighter now than it
Mhm.
was before dinner, and I can see where this is going, and
Mhm.
I don't wanna do this. And I mean, I think a lot of us have had moments like that,
Mhm.
probably not to the point of death,
Right.
hopefully, but,
Right.
but certainly moments where we're like, "Ah, this sucks."
Mhm.
I wish it wasn't like this. I don't want it to be like this.
Mhm.
And even moments perhaps in prayer of saying, "Why? Why?
Mhm.
Why is this like this?" And so I think
Yeah.
this is a very human moment that we can relate to
Mhm.
in a very powerful way that is maybe better than it is if we take it as some kind of divine foreknowledge. And
Mhm.
then we see the temple guards coming
Yes.
up.
Yeah. Yep, and I think growing up, I had a misunderstanding of who actually came
Yeah,
to arrest him. I thought it was, like, the same people that had been in the temple with
yeah,
him, that trying to, back him into a corner, but it's not, it's temple guards.
yeah,
So, at that moment, Judas has to point out who Jesus is, and that
yeah,
part never made sense to me. I'm like,
yeah,
if they know who Jesus is, why would he have to say, like, "It's the one I
yeah,
kiss?" Like, they know who he is.
yeah,
But apparently it was the temple guards that came to arrest him, so Jesus had
yeah,
to show them, and that's how he
yeah,
did it. And that kiss too, like, we
yeah,
talk about that kiss in,
yeah,
like, or you hear it
yeah,
again in movies or
yeah. The
in
Judas
Sunday school,
kiss,
yeah, the
yes.
Judas kiss. And one thing I always find myself questioning is, like, what would that mean?
Yeah,
Like, was it regret? But, like, I feel like Judas, and this is could be my own
yeah,
interpretation, Judas is doing this out of fear.
yeah,
Like, I don't wanna be
yeah,
condemned, I don't wanna be arrested. I'm gonna turn him in so that the
yeah,
rest of us possibly don't get in trouble, and that kiss is like, "I am so sorry, I love you to
yeah,
pieces, but I'm
Yeah.
here. Like, I don't
Yeah.
know, but
Yeah.
it's a very powerful moment for sure.
Oh, that's really interesting because I've always been like, well, why didn't you just point to him? Or like the dude over there praying, why'd you have to go kiss him? And you're right, it's deeply personal and a deeply personal sign of some sort of betrayal and whatever
Mhm.
the motivation was. And then Mark points out, or Mark Borgen Crossan point out that Mark then erases Judas from the story. We don't
Right.
know what happens to
Right.
Judas. So in Matthew, he hangs himself, and in
Mhm.
Luke, he like falls over and his entrails fall out.
Oh, yeah, in the middle of the
Yeah,
field.
in
Yeah.
Acts, the author of Luke, in the book of Acts, and so, but we don't really get an answer
Right.
for what happens to Judas, and I think that's really interesting that Judas just disappears into
Mhm.
history in
Yeah.
the Gospel of Mark,
Right.
and I don't know if that's more satisfying or less satisfying. I think the reason we get an answer in other places is because we want to see some kind of consequence for
Right.
Judas, but as far as we know, Judas could have gone right on back to his life and lived out his days
Mhm.
at happy, perhaps wealthy if he really got money for
Right.
betraying Jesus, and
Right.
we don't know.
We don't. Yeah.
We don't know. And then the guards take him back to the Sanhedrin, which is
Mhm.
one of our suspects. And Morgan Crossan point out that, was it really a Sanhedrin like we knew in later centuries? Well, maybe, maybe not. But whatever it
Right.
is, the council, the Sanhedrin, again, not of the Jews or Jewish
Mhm.
people generally, but of the temple authorities.
Right.
We get this group of decision makers about the from the temple authorities, the Sanhedrin, that then begin the trial of Jesus that we learn more about on Good Friday. And I think it is important to say too, as we have before, that had the Sanhedrin actually convicted Jesus, which
Mhm.
they could have done, I mean, we've talked about all of the things that Jesus did against the religious
Right.
establishment. They had plenty of grounds to do something.
Mhm.
That if they had committed him to death, it would have been death by stoning and not by
Mhm.
crucifixion. So I think that that's an important point as we're looking at our
Right.
suspect list, is that it wasn't them who actually condemned Jesus to death, because it
Right.
wasn't death by stoning. So maybe this is a good place
Right.
to start transitioning and looking towards Good Friday. So,
Mhm.
Marcella, do you want to talk a little bit about who our suspects from today are and how that might lead into Good Friday?
Yes. Well, sadly, the disciples,
Mhm.
we see also in this chapter that Peter denies him. The
Yeah.
rest of the disciples just kind of float off and
Yeah.
kind of hide behind other people, or who knows. Um, Judas, of course,
Yeah.
today there was a very heavy emphasis on Judas, what he did and betraying and actually pointing him out there
Yeah.
in the garden. And yeah, the Sanhedrin and the council, which I love how the book digs a little bit deeper into, there wasn't quite enough there for them to condemn him.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very
Mm.
interesting point about he would have been stoned had they been the ones to condemn him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that takes a shift, right?
Yeah.
Like, all of a sudden, it's like, "Well, you go off over here now, and, they can take care of you."
That's right. That's right. And I think that's gonna be a really important thing to talk about next week when we get
Mhm.
into what that trial actually might have looked like, what Jesus's death might have actually looked like. So,
Mm.
next week, we'll talk about Good Friday. We hope you can join us then on Who Killed Jesus.